All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, on the line, I've got the great Patrick Cockburn, of course, award-winning Middle East correspondent for The Independent and author of Chaos and Caliphate, and his latest book is War in the Age of Trump, and he's got this really important one. I hope you'll read it. It's at counterpunch.org. London and Washington are being propelled by hubris, just as Putin was. Welcome back to the show, Patrick. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Good to be back.
Good. Very great to talk to you again. So, really important piece that you write here. You start off with World War II and a comparison to America's policy toward Japan in 1941 before the Pearl Harbor attack. What are you getting at here?
Well, the confrontation with Japan imposing economic sanctions, thinking the Japanese are going to retreat. They don't. The same thing happened with Saddam Hussein in Iraq in 1990. And it seemed to me Putin did much the same. All these wars were kind of assumed that somebody would step back when in fact they stepped forward.
Yeah, very good point. So, and that seems to be the case really on all sides here in the war in Ukraine, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary war. Extraordinary that it was launched by Putin on the assumption that, his not very large army was going to face no political or military resistance in Ukraine. I thought he might attack Ukraine. I didn't think he'd attack Ukraine under such ludicrous ideas as that. And of course, things sort of fell apart almost immediately. We had the sort of an attack from all directions, none of them very strong, none of them got anywhere. Now we have the second round down in Donbass. And then we have, which again doesn't seem to be getting anywhere very far, although they captured Mariupol and quite a lot of prisoners. And the question is, will we have a third round? Also, what will happen in Russia? Will they have national mobilization? It's pretty extraordinary that Putin went ahead with this sort of special military operation and recently treated it like that. There hasn't been any national mobilization like Ukraine. Ukraine was preventing anybody of military age leaving the country, mobilize their reserve. Putin never did that. Will that happen now? But also, the point I was trying to make is that this sort of triumphalism that you see in all the, certainly in the media I see, American and British, is leading, it seems to me, to a sort of extraordinary sort of hubris and arrogant thinking. Russia can be defeated easily, or that we can have a stalemate in Ukraine. It doesn't much matter. I think it matters a lot, because I think you end up with a stalemate like that in Syria, in which the whole country is devastated.
Yeah. All right. So there's so many points to bring up there. If we can go back to just how the battle's going now, I saw that the Russians, I guess, I'm not exactly sure the extent of this, but supposedly they have taken the town of Kherson, which looks to be on the map like sort of the New Orleans of the Dnieper River there, and not very far at all from Odessa. And then Odessa itself is not very far from Transnistria, this breakaway province of Moldova on the Ukrainian and Moldovan border there. And there's been some violence there, at least in Transnistria. So I wonder if you think that the Russians' goals, I'm sorry to ask you to predict, does it look like their goals now are to push all the way through and take the entire southern coast and connect the so-called land bridge that they have connected to Crimea so far? And do you think they'll keep going and try to connect to Transnistria there?
I'm sure they'd like to, but, so far they haven't been able to. They don't seem to have enough soldiers to do that. The Ukraine has been heavily supplied with weapons by the US and the NATO powers. It's very difficult to see that happening. But has Putin abandoned these ambitions? It doesn't appear so. But they'd have to actually do these things. They'd have to sort of have national mobilization. They'd have to redirect industry to supply the armed forces. They'd have to probably introduce martial law. They'd have to sort of go in for a total war in a way that they haven't so far. Otherwise, they'll be caught up in a sort of stalemate, which in some ways will be like, I can compare with Syria. But I don't think in Syria, it could be sort of marginalized, or it was within one not very big country. But I think it'd be difficult to have the same sort of stalemate in Ukraine, because there's the question of, would NATO try to break the Russian blockade of the Ukrainian ports, which is preventing the export of Ukrainian grain? Would the Russians attack Western Ukraine to prevent NATO supplies getting through? There are all sorts of ways that the situation could escalate rapidly. And there's still, I don't know about the US, but there's still this sort of strange, what I refer to as a 1914 mood in a lot of Europe. I think it may be being a little, but not much, that sort of, people wanting to fight the war, not sort of thinking it through. The whole question of, will the Russians use nuclear weapons? If they're pushed in a corner, it hardly makes a headline. And, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you had enormous sort of anti-war movements, or people really worried about the use of nuclear weapons. And now it's dismissed. And it's dismissed by people who, on one hand, will tell you Putin is a sort of mad monster and to have invaded Ukraine. But at the same time, when you say, well, what about the possible use of nuclear weapons? Either they say, well, you're a Putin proxy to even bring it up, or that somehow Putin is a kind of going to be a pussycat, in using them. He's going to be rational, he's going to be cautious. And so you can't have both. He's either a mad monster or he's a timid fellow, but he's not both. So it's a very sort of strange atmosphere, I think, in the US and Europe at the moment.
Yeah. Well, really, on that point, there's so many great points to follow up here, but on the unreality of it all, it does remind me a lot of 20 years ago, where you got a lot of slogans and a lot of bluster, and nobody wants to really think very deeply about this because they don't like the answers. Just like you're talking about here, where they're sort of acting like nukes aren't a potential problem here, when obviously they are. We all know that they are, but what we'll do? We'll just go ahead and see how far we can push this anyway. Wow, and there seems to be. I'm sorry, I forget who I'm plagiarizing here, but I just was reading something, a take I agree with, that said that it was Jeffrey Sachs was saying he knows of not a single American senior official of any party, you could throw in congressmen, I guess, at the highest levels, who are insisting on negotiating here. Not one. The idea is it's not even, and here we are, we're 13 weeks into the war. It's not even a controversy that we're not negotiating here. I guess it would be a controversy if someone proposed negotiations. Instead, we're supposed to somehow win this war, I guess. What does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. Does it mean overthrowing Putin? But, you also have sort of senior American intelligence people saying that they don't think Putin would use nuclear weapons unless they feel the Russian state is in danger, or unless they feel the regime is in danger. On the other side of the line, you have people who say, yeah, we want to get rid of the regime. We want regime change, So you don't, you have to consider these two positions and the likely outcome, which is pretty horrendous. And I find it difficult to understand why there's this sort of war hysteria. And, in the meantime, in Europe, prices are zooming up, obviously, of fuel, of almost everything. Every other country in the world is being affected. Countries that never even heard of Ukraine, like South Sudan, suddenly they're facing high prices for any food they might like to import. So people are being pushed into malnutrition, and so forth.
Yeah.
So, it's a bizarre situation. And also, what exactly is happening in Russia? Nobody really knows what's happening within the Russian elite. It's pretty clear that Putin, made a disastrous decision in launching the invasion. He seems to have made fairly disastrous decisions afterwards of sort of claiming that this was sort of not quite a war and not behaving as if it was. You seem to have sort of criticism, not from the guys who want to end the war or think it's a bad idea to launch the war, but criticize well, don't directly criticize Putin, but criticize the government in general for not fighting a total, for amateurism and so forth. How far does this pose a threat to Putin? Well, it's a bit like Saddam Hussein. I think it's a bit like Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait in 1990. It was a disastrous decision. He was tremendously defeated, much more than the Russians have been in Ukraine. Yet he still climbed onto power for 13 years. Could the same thing happen with Putin? Nor is there an obvious successor. But, one should be careful about this, because I always feel with coups and putsches against leaders, the one that succeeds is the one that nobody sees coming, that everybody says wasn't possible for the following reasons. So I don't think you can entirely rule that out if Putin continues to preside over this sort of shambles.
That's right. I mean, if you listen to the, Ann Applebaums of the world, then regime change would automatically result in an improvement from the Western point of view. We would get a compliant government that would then do what DC says, and we'll have another Yeltsin and get him drunk, and it'll be fine again. And they don't even broach the possibility that you might get a real tough guy. Maybe Putin isn't Hitler. Maybe he's Hindenburg. And we should settle for that.
I think he's more like Mussolini, actually. I think it's more sort of, Mussolini sort of launched military ventures, in Ethiopia and attacked Greece famously in 1941 with rather disastrous results for himself. And, this, I think, if you look at Putin and you look at Mussolini as that same sort of militaristic posture, the same sort of hubris. And, but one can think of all sorts of historic analogies, why did he do it? One asks. Well, the simplest explanation is that Russia had a lot of grievances. Yes, they felt they were being pushed by NATO, but also that Putin had been 22 years in power, had a high opinion of his own abilities, and was surrounded by sort of advisors who were sort of courtiers who told him what he wanted to hear. So this led him to sort of launch this disastrous escapade.
Sure, I mean, motive to do it is one thing, but that's not the only reason to make a decision. The idea that, it's going to be easy would probably play into it. And it does seem that, I don't know, was he convinced by some Russian neoconservatives that he was going to be greeted with flowers and candy, at least in the east of the country, that this is just going to be great? And because it seems like that would be the reason that they didn't call in the massive air power to soften up the forces in the east before they rolled in the way they did, was just for PR reasons, right? But then that didn't work out.
I guess
well.
so. They can obviously just completely underestimate it. But do you remember a rather large invasion that happened in 2003 when lots of guys were going to say the US Army was going to be sort of greeted with flowers and sweets when it arrived in Baghdad, and everything would be fine, and it wasn't. And presumably Putin got similar advice. But I think that, there's a lack of realism about this. What if Russians suffer a defeat? Will it be a final defeat? Will they march on Moscow? I doubt it, Will Putin go? And if he goes, will he be, will there be somebody who's a lot tougher than he is, as you just said? What resources do they have left? Or is the whole regime so sort of rotted by corruption and despotism that it can't really fight back?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, Patrick, even if they just stop at Crimea, they have, I guess it depends on your map, but the greater Donbass region there includes all the land, Mariupol and that whole Azov coast there, all the way to Crimea. And they've got that, the freshwater resources. If they just called it quits here and said, okay, we're securing the independence of the Donbass, then the question would still remain whether the Ukrainians would try to stay at war to fight that and kick them all the way out. But it seems like the Russians at least would be able to hold on to the east. They've sure got it now, don't they? I guess they lost
Yeah,
Kharkiv.
I mean, these things could happen. And, you see, so, it depends how much the Ukrainians believe their own press clippings, really, or they see on television,
Yeah.
and
It
how
depends on the
far that.
American weapons too, doesn't it? A lot. It seems like that's already making a difference over there.
Sure, yeah, but it's clear, that the Russians, what's the Russian? At some degrees, this is weapons, but it's also, the Russians, their biggest shortage seems to have been infantry. Which they just didn't have the guys, who were in the trucks who are going to take part in the invasion, and to a substantial degree, they still don't. Could they change that? Well, possibly, but it's getting pretty late to do that while Ukraine is fully mobilized.
Yeah.
The danger from the Ukrainian point of view, I think, is that one, that this goes to their head, that they sort of think we're going to completely defeat the Russians and let the war rumble on. But wars are notorious for people thinking they're on the verge of complete victory, and a year later they've been suffered a shattering defeat. Like, all wars are a bit like that. But there's another question, which comes up in, compare it to Syria or wars in the Middle East, that on the one hand you get support from allies outside, you get weapons, you get advisors, and so forth, but you also, to some degree, greater or lesser degree, become their proxies and import their quarrels. So Syria became the sort of arena in which lots of quarrels are being fought out, which didn't have much to do with Syria, between the Turks and the Kurds, between the Americans and the Iranians. Part of this was in Iran, but basically it became the arena for a whole series of interrelated wars, military conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
And it became very difficult to disentangle them and to end the war. Now, could the same thing happen in Ukraine? As you just mentioned, that nobody in senior official in Washington wants to negotiate or end the war. That might be good for the US, but is it good for Ukraine? Also these wars go on. You just get more and more things get blown up. More and more of the people leave, become refugees. Who do you lose people who go abroad. You begin to, I remember Iraq, all the doctors went. The people who went to the university, the people who could get, after a bit, sticking it out for a bit, you think, how about applying for that job in New Zealand or, or in San Francisco or something?
Mm-hmm.
So, countries begin to lose their best educated people, their most skilled workers. People can get a job elsewhere.
Right.
And a lot of this devastation, if you use heavy artillery for long enough, you basically pulverize city after city. And again, there are questions. That's what's so strange about this war, is the Russians invaded, but they didn't, for instance, try to destroy the Ukrainian infrastructure. If you cast your mind back to 1991, when the US attacked Iraq, the bombing, I was in Baghdad at the time, the bombing, what did they do? They attacked the power lines, they dropped these long sort of wires, shorted all the overhead power lines, they hit the oil refineries, they hit the power stations. There are various parts of the infrastructure that can't be hidden and can't be moved, and which you can destroy with missiles pretty easily. That hasn't actually happened yet in a systematic way. It still could happen. How far is that the Russians didn't want to do it? How far is it that they're just so disorganized they weren't able to do it effectively?
Mm-hmm.
We still don't really know about that.
Hang on just one second. Hey guys, I had some wasps in my house. So I shot them to death with my trusty Bug Assault 3.0 model with the improved salt reservoir and bar safety. I don't have a deal with them, but the show does earn a kickback every time you get a Bug Assault or anything else you buy from Amazon.com by way of the link in the right-hand margin on the front page at scotthorton.org. So keep that in mind. And don't worry about the mess. Your wife will clean it up. Green Mill Supercritical is the award-winning leader in cannabis oil extraction. Their machines are absolute top of the line. They simply work better and accomplish more for less than any competitor in the world. We are talking anywhere from a couple of $100,000 for the base model and up. So this is for serious business people here. But the price, as they say, will be worth it. Green Mill Supercritical customers' investments pay for themselves oftentimes in just weeks. Simple enough for almost any operator, deep enough for master technicians. Their new novel techniques for inline real-time winterization are leaving their competitors in the keef. That's greenmillsupercritical.com. Man, I wish I was in school so I could drop out and sign up for Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom instead. Tom has done such a great job on putting together a classical curriculum for everyone from junior high schoolers on up through the postgraduate level. And it's all very reasonably priced. Just make sure you click through from the link in the right margin at scotthorton.org. Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Real history, real economics, real education. Yeah, I mean, you have weapons coming from the far west of the country, a nation the size of Texas, or the size of Afghanistan or France, if people want a comparison, something like that. And they're coming from and it's a pretty long ways country laying down on its side too, coming from the far west of the country all the way to the battlefields in the east across how many bridges, that are still standing. Again, that seems, I guess the idea was that was part of the PR. Was we're going to come in soft because we expect the people in the east of the country to be glad we're here. And then they didn't really have much of a plan B or C, I guess, because they're,
Yeah, but that's pretty stupid. And also,
it is stupid.
all
Then again,
armies
it's
of
the 20th
occupation are pretty
anniversary of.
nasty. They're pretty nasty because they arrive maybe on sort of for a few hours. They believe what they've been told, beforehand, that you're going to be greeted with sort of flowers and sweets. But somebody shoots at them. Maybe they sort of shoot at each other.
Yeah.
As often happens in wars. One lot of Russian troops are shooting at another lot of Russian troops and thinks they're being attacked by Ukrainian villagers. Then they start rounding up people and shooting them. Occupations are always pretty brutal and they always produce a reaction. Now, this isn't to excuse the Russians at all, but they seem to have sort of got the worst of all possible worlds. They came in, they imagined that they'd be welcomed. Putin was calling on the Ukrainian army to get rid of Zelensky and lay down its arms. All this is the stuff of fantasy. And then, when the troops come under attack, they start shooting civilians. I mean, I've never sort of seen an occupation or invasion where this didn't happen. It's used to. In Baghdad, I remember American troops, very dangerous to get close to them. After the first few suicide bombings, because any car that got close to an American vehicle, they'd first shoot at the engine, then they'd shoot at the driver. The British Army in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, a famous, I think, called the Ballymurphy Massacre, which seems to have been the result of two groups of British, started when two groups of British paratroopers started accidentally shooting at each other. Imagined they were being shot at by the local inhabitants, a number of whom they then shot dead. That this is the pattern of all wars. And I don't, one thing that strikes me is just the reportage of this war. It's sort of 1914 type stuff. It's perfectly reasonable. We're talking about Syria to say that the Russians are behaving as before, devastating places like they did in Damascus or East Aleppo with artillery and attacking civilian areas. But that's true. But then, if you go to the east of Syria, you come to the city of Raqqa, which is completely devastated, city of about 400,000, which is completely devastated from one end to the other, which was primarily, American firepower, American air power. Or you can go to Mosul, the west side of the city, the old city, is just a great heap of ruins. Again, that's mostly Americans and sort of Iraqi artillery. You start using artillery in built up areas, that's what happened. Now, of course, this doesn't excuse everything, but if you have total sort of demonization of the Russians, it gets very difficult to end this type of war. And that's what I find pretty depressing. It sort of reminds me of all the wars I've seen, mostly in the Middle East, in which one side becomes convinced they're winning or have won, which they haven't. And these wars go on endlessly. And and I think this has got since I sort of first started reporting wars, is that the media sort of divides everything into white hats and black hats. So it becomes very difficult to negotiate an end to this. I mean, in Damascus, diplomats, including American diplomats, who wanted to sort of see if they could arrange some sort of truces and ceasefires at the beginning of the war in 2011, would say openly, that the press coverage was such that even sort of talking to the government side to arrange ceasefire became sort of politically impossible. And the coverage from Ukraine seems to me to be the same. And just, what's the policy of this war? You have this enormous mass mobilization everywhere, but as you said yourself, is the aim to defend Ukraine? That used to be it. And anybody who said differently, that it was to regime change Russia, was denounced as sort of an apologist for Putin. And 3 months later, the policy seems to be at least largely regime change in Moscow. Anybody who disagrees with that is an apologist for Putin. So this is very crude stuff. And, and also I think there's a sense that we've seen the worst of this war, but actually, so far Russia hasn't been waging total war, which it could do presumably by destroying the Ukrainian infrastructure with missiles. That's not easy to do, but it's doable. They could do that. They could have a national mobilization. All these things could still happen. And there's this really rather extraordinary sort of happy-go-lucky attitude by governments, by Washington, of thinking, just let this go on.
Well, Patrick, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who's kind of a conservative old anti-interventionist, retired Army officer, he had said from the beginning, and he said this to me again recently, that here any time now, the Germans are going to insist that we wind this thing down, right? As you already mentioned, consequences for, prices and availability of foodstuffs for the people of Europe is already in jeopardy here. This is already on the table, and not even to mention south of the equator and the rest, as you said. At some point, the Germans are going to have to insist that, look, we can't just fight an Afghanistan or Syrian-style, dirty war in Eastern Europe, right on Russia's border, and not just with tow missiles, but with javelins and stingers and all of this stuff, and for some pretty radical, moderate rebels there in Ukraine as well. I mean, at some point, somebody's got to tell, just as Merkel came and told Obama, I'm going to go sign this Minsk II deal with Putin. And he said, okay. Right? It wasn't his idea. It was Merkel insisted on that, and not that they ever implemented it. But you know what I mean? But so I'm waiting for that to kick in, where somebody tells Joe Biden he has to cool off.
But it could also be an escalation.
I'm sorry, say again.
Well, it could be the response to the war going on, of a sort of basically a stalemate. I mean, a lot of violence, but a stalemate, with the Black Sea ports, Ukraine's Black Sea ports still blockaded and so forth, might be pressure for de-escalation. But given the current mood, it might also be pressure. Will also be a pressure for an escalation. Send more missiles to sink Russian ships or intervene directly to lift the blockade. That seems to me just as feasible, perhaps even more feasible. But again, what's so worrying that these sort of great decisions seem to be sort of taken in a sort of cavalier, sort of uncaring way, as if they didn't matter too much, and without any counterpush from anyone. And that's true, and as far as I can see in America, it's certainly true in Britain and in much of Western Europe.
Yeah.
So,
Patrick, in your
but I'm
article,
kind of influenced. I'm influenced, Scott, by the fact that most wars I've seen just don't end. People think they've won, haven't won. They just go on, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan.
yeah.
The and I
Let me
remember.
ask you about that because I know that you've covered more than a dozen wars, right?
Sure, yeah,
Yeah. And people, I think I don't want anyone to take this the wrong way because there is kind of a common theme here in the media where Ukrainian lives matter so much more than Iraqi ones and this kind of thing. When life is cheap to a Westerner in the Orient, that kind of deal. But my point is not that so much as the level of risk in having a proxy war with Russia. I mean, frankly, America could beat up on Saddam Hussein all day and even lose to an insurgency there without any real cost to our army at all. We just had to leave. But you know what I mean? It's not like our infantry was
sure,
decimated, right? So, but here we're talking, the level of risk here is just absolutely out of control. It's like having the Vietnam War or something right on Russia's border. And it's so much more important. And yet they're just going on as though they're just picking on Saddam Hussein, who they know good and well can't really do anything about it. And that's the part that is really unsettling is the unreality. I know they're going to lie to me all day, but they seem to even be lying to themselves about who it is that they're messing with here.
yeah. I think that I think there are other contributory reasons. Russia was meant to have a powerful army, but that people were frightened of, but then it goes into Ukraine and falls flat on its face. So maybe that sort of reduced the level of anxiety about what the Russians did. Maybe it'll go on doing that, but maybe not. Nobody's very keen, for instance, to invade North Korea because they think that nuclear weapons will be used almost immediately. But somehow the sort of the fear level of what Putin might do, what Russia might do, has gone right down, perhaps propelled by their failure so far. And there's just thinking back to Afghanistan 2001, 2, there was the same triumphalism, but the war not only wasn't over, it's scarcely been fought. The Taliban had gone home. Defeat of Saddam Hussein because he'd been considered, the guy who was responsible for everything goes wrong in Iraq. But the guy, what followed him was actually far more dangerous. It's a rather sort of similar mood, but very little sort of concern about it. And for quite a long time, the Ukrainians were Zelensky was kind of playing things down. But more recently, it sounds as if they sort of a certain arrogance was taking over there as well. So I think the situation is pretty bad, is pretty unexpected, and full of sort of nasty surprises. And just like it's worth recalling that almost everything which the media thought and pundits thought would happen in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya didn't happen. In fact, the reverse happened. So there's quite good reasons for thinking they'll get it wrong again. And that doesn't, I mean, you look at the quality of the leaders, you look at Putin, seems, pretty crackers. The living in something of a fantasy world, Boris Johnson, hopping from, sloganeering the whole time, trying to stay in office, but pretty weak, shambolic government. You look at Biden, looks pretty feeble and so forth. I don't know, how far do these people Johnson can say obviously has political advantages from doing his sort of Winston Churchill act
Yeah.
and rushing about Europe. Biden, does this do Biden much good in America? Does he sort of politically, any polls I see, it doesn't. And I doubt even, in Britain, the cost of living is shooting up, 10%. I think people's sort of interest in the war is ebbing, or in other ways being overlaid by, concern about this sort of what looks like a economic calamity.
Hmm. After all, Patrick, people don't even know where Ukraine is. It's so far from here. It's on the other side of Slovakia from here. I mean, it might as well be the far side of the moon. So it's pretty hard to keep people interested in something like that, Most people thought it was the Ukraine. Isn't that a region of Russia anyway? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think so. I don't. I mean, I mean, I can't think of any war I've ever reported that had a sort of good result for pretty well for either side because it's uncontrollable. It has too many moving parts. I think politicians are the qualities that make a successful politician make a really bad warlord because they're dealing with a situation with which they'll get a lot of plaudits, for being tough with the enemy. But they're in a crisis with so many moving parts.
Mm-hmm.
Moving parts they have no experience of, but they don't really know which way it's going to go. They're sort of prisoners of events. And maybe the US thinks, this is a chance to become the sole superpower once again. And that certainly worries, Chinese, not just Chinese, but the India, Turkey and others, that they quite liked the Russia to be there as an alternate sort of superpower, at least nuclear. That worries them. But it's a situation in which there are, so many calamitous things could happen that, it's impossible to predict. But again, we come back to a point we were discussing earlier on, is what's extraordinary is the sort of just lack of alarm at any level.
Yeah.
At the risks involved in this war.
Yeah, it's true. I have a semi-regular guest spot on a cable TV news show, and I skipped it one time. I didn't have a chance, but every single time I try to say it's been this long since our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has spoken with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. And it seems to me like that is the single most important political question on the planet facing all of mankind is when is the Secretary of State sitting down with the foreign minister in Geneva that they can come to an end to this war? How could there be any other priority in all of world politics other than stopping the fighting here as absolutely soon as possible? And the only one saying it on there, it's just that's not the narrative. The narrative is Jack Keane says we just need to pour in some more javelins. Cha-ching.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of this idea of achieving military victory, but what would it look like? It's not really there. And it's a great sort of gigantic leap into the dark.
Hang on just 1 second. Hey, y'all, the audiobook of my book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, is finally done. Yes, of course, read by me. It's available at Audible, Amazon, Apple Books, and soon on Google Play and whatever other options there are out there. It's my history of America's war on terrorism from 1979 through today. Give it a listen and see if you agree. It's time to just come home. Enough already. Time to End the War on Terrorism. The audiobook. Hey guys, I've had a lot of great webmasters over the years, but the team at expanddesigns.com have by far been the most competent and reliable. Harley Abbott and his team have made great sites for the show and the Institute, and they keep them running well, suggesting and making improvements all along. Make a deal with expanddesigns.com for your new business or news site. They will take care of you. Use the promo code SCOTT and save $500. That's expanddesigns.com. Hey guys, Scott Horton here for Listen and Think Libertarian Audiobooks. As you may know, the audiobook of my new book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism is finally out. It's co-produced by our longtime friends at Listen and Think Libertarian Audiobooks. For many years now, Derek Sheriff over there at Listen and Think has offered lifetime subscriptions to anyone who donates $100 or more to the Scott Horton Show at scotthorton.org/donate or to the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And they've got a bunch of great titles, including Inside Syria by the late, great Reese Erlich. That's listenandthink.com. Well, now, wait a minute. If I was the Secretary of State, I would just say essentially the original Russian proposal with obviously some land swaps, as the Israelis would say, some kind of, wiggle room in here. But essentially, Crimea has been independent. That ship sailed in 1783, if not 2014. Forget that. And the Donbass, you're not going to be able to kick the Russians out of there without keeping the fighting going for an infinite period of time. So just let the Donbass go anyway, and let the Russians be happy with that. And America's not going to give them a war guarantee anyway. So we'll probably give them some weapons, but they could promise not to join NATO. We could promise not to bring them into NATO. And that's a good start. And we could offer verification for our missile launchers in Poland that we're not putting tomahawks
I
in
think,
there.
I think, Scott, that at this stage, Ukraine is going to ask for a guarantee, a cast-iron guarantee that it doesn't get invaded again. That's perfectly reasonable. There's no doubt Putin has created the situation which he claimed he was most threatened by. He has, in most senses, brought NATO into Ukraine. They may not formally join NATO, and protected under what's called the Fifth Article, that an attack on Ukraine is an attack on NATO. But they're clearly going to ask for guarantee of their frontier, because reasonably enough, they think, what if we get attacked again? What if Russia reorganizes and decides to have a second go? So that's not unreasonable. Things that could have been done before the war can no longer be done.
That's true.
The Minsk II agreement is that sort of, it has become sort of ancient history. I think there was a moment during the first sort of month of the war, or maybe it could have been revived, and there could have been some sort of agreement. But, the Russian, Putin's failure was so complete, and he clearly feels that, if he doesn't win this war, he's fighting for his own existence. So, I think that would be pretty difficult. But there's less attempt to even put together the framework of a peace agreement, than almost any conflict I can think of. What you say, that's true in the US, it's certainly true in UK.
Yeah, I think it was the British Prime Minister who went over there, Boris Johnson, and told them don't negotiate right at the time when there really was a chance to. He told them to stick it out.
So,
you compared him to
that, but I think that Putin also, seems to be living in this fantasy world. There was a moment when the Ukrainians said, well, Crimea will push it for 15 years and then we'll discuss it, so they weren't going to do that. There seemed a possibility that an agreement could be reached over Donbass. The Russians withdrew from the north and sent their troops around. But, there seemed at the end of April to be, Ukrainians seemed to be offering real things. The Russians seemed to be sort of negotiating, then it disappeared. Both sides think they can still make gains on the battlefield, which, may or may not be true. But we'll see how that goes. But I think that people still sort of vastly underestimate how dangerous this is. You have to people suppose there's one tactical nuclear weapon used in West Ukraine, what's going to be the result? People say, well, it wouldn't be very big, so forth. But once just the very fact of a nuclear weapon, even a small tactical nuclear weapon being used, one reaction is going to be a gigantic flood of refugees out of Ukraine.
And I have to tell you, because
Uh,
I read about these war games where they said, "Look, this is the Russian doctrine: is escalate to de-escalate. And if we get in a war, we use one nuke. From the Russian point of view, they use one small nuke to convince us to back off, but we have to convince them. We will never back off. And if they use a nuke, then we'll use a bigger nuke. Now they better de-escalate." That's the American response to their presumed Russian policy here.
sure, yeah, but it's all sort of. I mean, the answer is they don't know what they do. And
Well,
I
that
think one thing I want to keep in mind is just that that if you look at all the leaders in Europe and Russia and America, these are very sort of weak guys. These are very sort of governments that there's not a lot you can say about them. The Boris Johnson is currently kind of screwing up the peace agreement in Northern Ireland. This is a kind of pretty frivolous guy with a pretty frivolous government. The idea that these guys are taking decisions about nuclear peace and war is pretty frightening.
Yeah. Hey, without getting too
And
far into that, could you explain a little what you mean about him ruining the peace agreement in Northern Ireland? Because that seemed to be the one thing the U.S. government did right in the last 30 years I could think of, was help negotiate that thing.
well, we had an election on the 5th of May in which Sinn Féin became the largest party in the north. Um, Now, Johnson is threatening to unilaterally drop key parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which puts the sort of trade barrier between Britain, mainland Britain, and Northern Ireland. But you've got to have a barrier somewhere. So would it be sort of within Ireland? Well, that's not, that wouldn't be acceptable to the Irish nationalists, north or south. This was a long-running dispute which had been sort of settled, or largely settled through the Good Friday Agreement, and suddenly all these issues have been opened up again. The British government is threatening just to walk away from, an agreement that was signed by Johnson. What will he'll push back against the EU when he's in the past when he's done this. Normally he's been humiliated because it's the EU who's got the big battalions these days. Is just stronger than Britain. Would that happen again? But it's all pretty frivolous but dangerous stuff. The and it's very difficult. Does the British government actually see this after? One of the big achievements, perhaps the biggest achievement of the British government over the last 50 years, was to negotiate an end to the troubles in Northern Ireland. But all those sort of the building blocks of that are all being sort of thrown away. I don't think violence is going to break out again, but it's going to be a peculiar situation. The largest party in the north is Sinn Féin. The largest party in the south after the next election is likely to be Sinn Féin. The peace agreement in the north depended on good relations between Catholics and Protestants, or nationalists and unionists, good relations between the British government and the Irish government, good relations with the EU. All these things are being sort of undermined. It's only a microcosm, but it shows a sort of level of judgment which is, pretty dire. And when one thinks about that, you think, well, what if the same level of judgment is applied to what's happening in Ukraine and Eastern Europe? What will the outcome be? And I suppose that Johnson would like to think that Ukraine, he's going to be what the Falkland War was to Margaret Thatcher. But I doubt it, because Britain isn't fully engaged there. There's a sort of terrifying, or for much of the population, a terrifying increase in the cost of living. With people unable to heat their houses or having to choose between doing that and eating 3 times a day.
Yeah, seriously. Well, now, so lastly here, you have a little aside in your article, Patrick, about the Spanish flu, as it was called, the Woodrow Wilson flu of World War One, and also even the outbreak of AIDS and what all that might have to do with war. So, what?
Oh yeah, this is sort of something I did. This extra things that get sort of tacked on the bottom I write at the bottom of articles, which sort of rather disparate thoughts. Yeah, no, interesting. I didn't realize this. I thought AIDS was much more, HIV/AIDS was a fairly modern development, but it's began, or it was first sort of located in 1916 and in Kinshasa in Congo. And it was a sort of outcome of the war. What happened was they have identified where it began. I mean, where it transferred from chimpanzees to humans was in southeast Cameroon in the rainforests. And it had been there, present for a long time. Then this was a German colony in the First World War. The British and the Allies sent native African troops as part of a force to fight the Germans. They didn't provide enough food for them, so they used their weapons to sort of shoot local wildlife, including the chimpanzees. Somewhere through infected blood or somebody was. Anyway, it was apparently a Congolese soldier went back to Kinshasa and had the jump had happened. He had AIDS and it sort of festered there for decades, and then finally sort of spread out to the rest of the world. But it was a consequence of the war, of the First World War, and suddenly guys with guns being in these rainforests. Previously, obviously there'd been people there, but they had bows and arrows and spears, and they didn't go after chimpanzees because they're pretty dangerous. Suddenly, you had guys with guns who were hungry, shot them, and the jump happened. Anyway, I find it interesting because I'd never heard that before.
Yeah, it's amazing. And of course, you bring up the Spanish flu too, which, as you correctly say in here, it's only called the Spanish flu because they weren't censoring their media at the time. Everybody had the flu, and it was really Woodrow Wilson's fault more than anybody for intervening in that
Well,
war.
it was in these big American training camps that I think it first developed. And you had lots of guys, recruits coming in from the countryside who had no immunity against anything. And the flu developed there and spread very rapidly. And then, ships going to carrying troops to Europe, some of them were sort of, full of dead and dying people by the time they got to Europe. And yeah, you're right. I mean, this was censored, certainly censored in Britain and so forth, and played down. But in Spain, they didn't censor it, and they ended up being called Spanish. Again, another consequence of the First World War. I knew about that. Most people know about that, but HIV, I didn't, and AIDS, I didn't realize that was also an outcome of the First World War.
Yeah, I didn't either. And it's interesting. You link in the piece to a BBC radio documentary about that too. If people are interested in the origin of that, he's got the link there. And it's only kind of an aside because you're talking about the unintended, unimaginable consequences of getting into a war. I mean, who would have thought the Schleifen plan included getting AIDS in the Congo?
Exactly. No, that's the so frightening thing. Who would have thought, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, that eventually this was to powerfully contribute to the creation of Islamic State,
Yeah.
And nobody thought that, and people are so curiously caught by surprise by that. But all wars means that, as I said, there are so many surprising developments, and there are so many moving parts that it's unpredictable. And I think it goes to politicians' heads. I think the kind of person who becomes a politician would really, they all have a sort of greater or less sort of Napoleon complex. They really like the idea of being sort of warlords, of which they've got no experience, and they don't see the risks involved.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming back on the show, Patrick. It's really been great.
No, I enjoyed it. All
right, you guys. That is the great Patrick Cockburn from The Independent. That's independent.co.uk. And here he is at his late brother, Alexander Cockburn's counterpunch. London and Washington are being propelled by hubris, just as Putin was. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.